Emily Lawson was a 27-year-old woman who had always dreamed of traveling the world. Her latest trip took her to a beautiful remote resort on the coast of a foreign country, a destination known for its tranquil beauty and peaceful seclusion. It was the kind of place where tourists often arrived seeking respite to get away from the noise of everyday life and simply relax. Emily arrived at the resort alone, like she had done with so many of her other solo adventures. The hotel was just the right mix of luxury and solitude, perfect for a lone traveler in search of inner peace. She checked into her room on a sunny afternoon, exchanging pleasantries with the hotel staff, just as any other guest would. The front desk clerk remembered her well, polite, with a quiet smile that gave nothing away. Emily asked for a room with a view of the sea and received a key to room 315. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. She was just another solo traveler. With no reason to draw attention to herself, she was supposed to stay for 3 nights, but by the next morning, she had vanished. It started off like any other missing persons case. At least, that's what local authorities initially thought. Emily hadn't made any phone calls or social media posts since she checked in, which was unusual for her, but nothing that seemed alarming at first. When hotel staff went to check her room later in the day, they found it locked from the inside. The door was secure, her belongings were still neatly arranged, nothing was out of place. But then they noticed something unsettling. There, on the small table by the window, sat a half-finished cup of coffee. It was still warm. Emily couldn't have been gone for long. The room itself looked untouched, as if Emily had simply stepped out and would return in a moment. But no one saw her leave. No one heard the sound of a door opening, no unusual noises, not even a glimpse of her in the hallway. The hotel staff checked the grounds, the pool, the lobby, everywhere they could think of, but Emily was nowhere to be found. The strangest part was that her personal effects, passport, phone, and wallet, remained untouched. The items were exactly where they should have been, almost as if she had just stepped out for a brief moment, but that's when things began to unravel. Local law enforcement arrived and immediately started questioning the hotel staff, other guests, and anyone who might have seen something unusual. Yet no one could provide any answers. There were no security cameras in the hallways, and the few that existed were too blurry to offer any real clues. The staff didn't remember seeing anything out of the ordinary the morning Emily vanished. They recalled that she had been alone, reading a book by the window when they saw her last. The same applied to the guests who had stayed at the resort. No one had heard any signs of a struggle or anything that seemed amiss. The investigators, though confused, had no immediate reason to suspect foul play. They considered the possibility that Emily had simply decided to leave on her own, perhaps to go exploring or to check out other places. Some speculated that she might have been in some sort of trouble, maybe a personal crisis she hadn't shared with anyone. But as the hours passed, those theories didn't sit right with the authorities. Something about the situation felt wrong. The idea that she had simply disappeared voluntarily didn't add up. There was something eerie about the way everything had been left behind. The room was locked from the inside, yet there were no signs of a break-in or forced entry. Nothing was out of place. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture or broken items. The coffee cup sat there, its warmth beginning to fade as time dragged on, but the oddness lingered. It was as if Emily had just vanished, not just from her room, but from the world itself. There was no sign of her anywhere, no trace of where she had gone. The investigation turned into a frustrating mystery that seemed to lead nowhere. As the days went on, the authorities expanded their search. They scoured the resort grounds, the surrounding area, and even went so far as to inspect nearby forests and beaches. But Emily remained missing. The only clues they had were the odd details, the warm cup of coffee, the locked room, and the fact that no one had seen or heard anything unusual. Theories of abduction, voluntary disappearance, or even an accidental fall were all considered, but nothing fit. Each theory seemed to open more questions than it answered. What happened to Emily Lawson? Where had she gone? The room sat there, unchanged, as if time itself had frozen. The cup of coffee remained a haunting symbol of her sudden absence. And as the investigation continued, it became clear that something far darker may have been at play. But that realization, that understanding, wouldn't come until much later. For now, the mystery was as cold as the coffee she had left behind, and as the authorities searched for answers, Emily's family and friends could only wait, clinging to the hope that somewhere, in the vast silence of the resort, the truth might one day be found. The investigation was only beginning, but the strange circumstances surrounding Emily's disappearance would haunt those involved for years to come. As the days stretched on without any new leads, the investigation into Emily Lawson's disappearance grew more perplexing. The local police, now deeply involved, started by questioning the hotel staff and any guests who had been staying at the resort around the same time. The staff, still rattled by the strange disappearance, struggled to provide anything of substance. They all spoke of Emily in the same way, a quiet, friendly woman who appeared to be enjoying her stay, but there was nothing more they could offer. No one remembered seeing her leave, and no one had heard anything out of the ordinary. The other guests seemed just as unaware. The few who had been near her room reported that they hadn't seen anything strange in the hallway or heard anything unusual from within. One guest claimed to have passed Emily in the lobby that morning, but she had been walking alone, smiling as she headed back to her room. That was the last sighting anyone had of her. It was as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. Forensics, though thorough in their examination, found nothing that would suggest foul play. There were no signs of forced entry into the room, no blood or physical evidence to suggest a struggle. The door had been locked from the inside, and every item in the room appeared untouched. Emily's clothes, neatly folded at the foot of the bed, were exactly where she had left them. Her wallet, phone, and passport, all of her essential belongings, were still on the table, untouched. Even the cup of coffee, though no longer warm, remained on the table, evidence that she had been there moments before her disappearance. But nothing in the room offered any answers, only more questions. The lack of physical evidence left investigators scrambling for explanations. Could Emily have fled on her own? Maybe she had grown tired of her trip and decided to leave, abandoning her personal belongings without a second thought. That was one theory, though it didn't seem to fit with what the police knew about her. Emily was not the type of person to just disappear without telling anyone. Her family described her as reliable and considerate, someone who always stayed in touch, even when traveling alone. A voluntary disappearance didn't sit well with her loved ones, and they quickly rejected the idea that she might have run away, especially considering the bizarre circumstances. Her family, especially her mother, insisted that this was not like Emily. She had always kept in close contact with them, even when traveling in remote places. The idea of her abandoning her things in such a way, leaving no trace of her intentions, seemed out of character. They spoke to the authorities at length, urging them not to abandon the case but to dig deeper, to question whether foul play was involved. Was Emily kidnapped? Had she been taken by someone who knew her or by someone who had been watching her? Investigators began to consider the possibility of abduction. The lack of evidence pointing to a voluntary departure made this theory seem more likely, but the police still had no suspects. They looked into the guest list to see if there were any individuals with criminal records or anyone who might have acted suspiciously during their stay at the resort, but there was no clear connection. No one stood out as a person of interest, and no one could provide a description of someone who might have been lurking around her room. At this point, the authorities began to dig into Emily's past. They wanted to understand if there were any clues in her personal history that might shed light on what happened. Her social media accounts were combed through, and her phone records examined. Emily's life seemed ordinary at first glance. She was a freelance writer who traveled for work, a woman in her late 20s with a small circle of friends and family who adored her. There were no signs of any threats, no alarming messages, no strange contacts. Her last phone call, placed to her mother a few hours before she disappeared, was brief but typical of their relationship. She had talked about going for a walk around the resort, but nothing in the conversation suggested any cause for concern. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Emily wasn't the only one with unanswered questions. Her family started to worry about the implications of her disappearance. Could this be a case of a tourist being targeted in a foreign country? A tragic incident where a traveler simply became a victim? Her mother couldn't shake the feeling that Emily hadn't just wandered off. She had to believe something had happened, something that wasn't her daughter's fault. The authorities kept pushing forward, gathering more information, but the trail seemed to grow colder with each passing day. Was it possible that Emily had been abducted by someone she met at the resort, or was this something far more complicated? Without a ransom demand, without any suspect in sight, the investigators were left grasping at straws, running down every lead and considering every possibility, but still coming up empty. As the days turned into weeks, the frustration grew. Emily's disappearance felt more like a haunting than a mystery that could be solved. Theories of abduction began to take root, but without the evidence to back them up, they remained just that, rumors. The hotel staff, once full of assurances, now stood in shock, unable to explain how someone could have vanished without a trace. The case was slipping away, and the questions surrounding Emily's fate only deepened, casting an unsettling shadow over the resort where she had once been. The feeling that something sinister had occurred was beginning to set in, but no one could quite put their finger on what that something might be. It was as if Emily had been erased, with no one left to explain why or how. And in the silence that followed, the mystery of her disappearance only grew darker. As the weeks passed without any significant leads, Emily Lawson's case began to lose momentum. The local police, despite their best efforts, exhausted most of their avenues, and the investigation seemed to be at a standstill. There were no new witnesses, no trace of Emily, and no new evidence to bring them any closer to solving the mystery. Her room remained locked, untouched, as if it were frozen in time. Yet Emily herself had vanished completely. The silence surrounding the case grew heavier, and as the days turned into weeks, the investigation turned cold. Back in Emily's home country, her family was growing desperate. They couldn't sit idly by while their daughter's case slipped through the cracks. Emily's mother, especially, refused to believe that her daughter was simply gone without a trace, and she became determined to uncover the truth. With the local authorities seemingly out of leads, the family decided to take matters into their own hands. They hired a private detective, someone who could focus solely on the case and look at things from a fresh perspective. The private detective, a seasoned investigator named Mark Thompson, quickly got to work. He reviewed the police reports, examined the initial findings, and began reaching out to people who might have had contact with Emily in the days before her disappearance. His first step was to dig into Emily's personal life. What had she been doing before her trip? Had there been any signs of trouble or distress? It wasn't long before Thompson uncovered some troubling information. Emily had been in a long-term relationship with a man named James Callahan, who had also been traveling with her earlier in the year. The couple had appeared happy at first glance, but as Thompson dug deeper, he found evidence of a recent argument between them. Emily had confided in a close friend just before her trip that she and James were having issues in their relationship. There had been tension, disagreements, and a sense of distance that had started to grow between them. It wasn't unusual for couples to go through rough patches, but in this case, the timing seemed to raise more questions. The argument was apparently severe enough that Emily had considered ending the relationship, though there had been no sign of finality in her decision. Thompson's investigation began to shift focus. Could Emily's disappearance be linked to this unresolved tension? Was it possible that her partner had played a role in her vanishing? Could he have followed her to the resort, or even been involved in something darker? The detective was careful not to jump to conclusions, but the emotional strain between Emily and James seemed like it might be a piece of the puzzle. Emily had left her home country on her own, without James, and now she was missing, seemingly vanishing into thin air. The more Thompson dug, the more it seemed like there was something more personal at play here. Meanwhile, hotel management continued to insist that no foul play had occurred on their premises. They stood by their initial assessment. Emily had simply vanished. They provided no further assistance and continued to downplay the situation, which frustrated both the private detective and Emily's family. The lack of cooperation from the hotel made it even harder to piece together what had happened. It seemed like the staff was doing everything in their power to maintain the hotel's reputation, rather than helping to solve a mystery that could have been on their watch. They refused to provide any further details, claiming that the case was now a matter for the police, and that they had already done everything they could. As the investigation stagnated, the feeling of helplessness deepened. The private detective, though dedicated, was unable to find a clear lead. Emily's case, once filled with the potential for resolution, was quickly slipping into the category of an unsolved mystery, another missing person who might never be found. The detective continued to press on, reaching out to any new leads, trying to locate James Callahan, but every door he opened seemed to lead to another dead end. For Emily's family, the pain of not knowing grew worse with each passing day. The idea that their daughter could have vanished without a trace, swallowed up by the mystery of the resort, seemed impossible to accept. But as the months wore on and no new answers emerged, the harsh reality began to sink in. This was becoming a case that might never have closure. Despite their best efforts, Emily's family was left with nothing but uncertainty, a feeling that would continue to haunt them for years to come. The case of Emily Lawson, once full of promise, had become a cold file, marked by unanswered questions and emotional grief. And as time passed, it seemed increasingly unlikely that the mystery would ever be solved. The authorities moved on to other cases, and the search for Emily began to feel like a lost cause. Yet for those who loved her, the haunting uncertainty would linger, a reminder that some questions may never have answers. 7 months had passed since Emily Lawson disappeared from the remote resort, and with each day, the case seemed to slip further from the authorities' grasp. The investigation had grown cold, and no new leads had come forward. The hotel staff had long since moved on, the guests who had stayed at the resort had returned to their own lives, and the quiet town that had once been at the center of the mystery had returned to its peaceful routine. But Emily's family, still clinging to the hope of finding answers, kept pushing for a resolution. It was at this point that a new detective, David Granger, was assigned to the case. Granger was a seasoned investigator, known for his meticulous approach to cold cases. He had a reputation for seeing details that others missed, and his fresh perspective was just what Emily's case needed. Determined not to let the mystery fade into the background, Granger made the decision to revisit the hotel, the last place anyone had seen Emily. The hotel had changed little since Emily's disappearance. The same staff members were still working there, but Granger quickly noticed the subtle shift in atmosphere. The once bustling resort had become quieter, the memory of Emily's disappearance hanging over it like a shadow. The employees, who'd previously been helpful and cooperative, now seemed less eager to revisit the past. Some appeared almost too eager to move on, dismissing the incident as a case of a woman who had simply left without telling anyone. But Granger wasn't easily swayed. He started by conducting interviews with the new staff members who had joined since Emily's stay. Most of them had heard about the disappearance, but were too far removed to offer anything substantial. But then, a young receptionist named Sophia mentioned something that caught Granger's attention, a conversation with a guest who had stayed at the hotel the night Emily vanished. According to Sophia, this guest had reported seeing something unusual. A man, dressed in a dark jacket, had been seen entering the hotel late in the evening on the night Emily disappeared. The description was vague, but it was enough to spark Granger's interest. The man in the dark jacket wasn't anyone the hotel staff recognized, and the description didn't match any of the guests staying at the resort that night. According to the receptionist, the man had appeared somewhat out of place, though he hadn't raised any suspicions at the time. He had walked into the hotel's lobby, glanced around briefly, and then left just as quickly as he had arrived. There were no signs of him lingering around, but the brief interaction was enough to suggest that something wasn't quite right. Granger pressed further, asking Sophia if she had heard of anyone else who might have noticed the man. She recalled that another guest, an older woman who had stayed in the room next to Emily's, had mentioned hearing someone in the hallway that evening. The woman hadn't seen the man herself, but she described hearing footsteps followed by a faint knock at Emily's door. It wasn't unusual to hear sounds in the hallway, and the woman hadn't thought anything of it at the time. However, now that the case was being re-examined, Granger wondered if this seemingly insignificant detail could be connected. The detective's mind began to race. If the man in the dark jacket wasn't a hotel guest, who was he? And why had he been there that night? Was he someone Emily had known? Had she been involved with him in some way, or was he a complete stranger? The thought of Emily's disappearance being linked to a mysterious man outside the hotel's records was both unsettling and intriguing. Granger felt the weight of the case growing heavier with each new lead. He was no closer to solving the mystery, but the possibility that Emily had been involved with someone dangerous suddenly loomed larger than ever. Granger spent the next few weeks following up on this new lead. He reviewed guest records again, trying to track down any potential matches for the man seen entering the hotel. He scoured local police databases for anyone with a criminal background who might have had ties to the resort. But as the investigation unfolded, Granger came to the painful realization that they had no concrete way of identifying the man. The description was vague, the potential connections were loose, and the trail was growing colder with each passing day. Despite this setback, Granger refused to give up. The fact that a mysterious figure had been seen entering the hotel on the night of Emily's disappearance was enough to keep the case alive, and he knew he had to dig deeper. Could this man be the key to unlocking the mystery, or was it simply another dead end? Granger couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was hiding the truth about what had really happened to Emily. The investigation had shifted into darker territory, and though the answers were still elusive, Granger knew that every new detail was another step toward uncovering the truth. And as the case continued, the nagging question lingered. Was Emily's disappearance the result of something far more sinister than anyone had imagined? David Granger's investigation had begun to take shape in ways he hadn't expected. While the lead on the man in the dark jacket hadn't panned out, another, more disturbing thread began to unravel. Granger had spent the last few weeks interviewing former hotel guests and reviewing guest records, looking for any trace of Emily's connections beyond the hotel staff. He was searching for something, anything, that might explain why Emily had disappeared without a trace. It was in these records, buried deep within the hotel's database, that he found the first real clue. A small group of foreign tourists who had stayed at the hotel just a few weeks before Emily checked in. The group, consisting of 5 people, had been traveling together. They didn't appear to have much in common with the typical vacationers who stayed at the resort, and their behavior had raised a few eyebrows among hotel staff. They were reclusive, seldom interacted with other guests, and spent much of their time in private. This in itself wasn't unusual. Tourists were often focused on their own trips and rarely socialized with others, but something about the group's presence seemed off. They didn't participate in the usual activities, never ventured into town, and only interacted with the hotel staff when absolutely necessary. Granger dug deeper into the group's background, and what he uncovered sent a chill down his spine. One of the group members, a man named Jason Reed, had left abruptly the day after Emily's arrival. Reed was a tall, well-dressed man in his early 30s, and while he hadn't raised much suspicion at first, his departure was unusual. Hotel staff remembered that he checked out without any explanation, and his payment for the room was made in cash, an oddity for a resort that primarily dealt with international credit card transactions. A quick look into Reed's history showed a series of previous trips to countries with high levels of criminal activity, including ties to some unsavory dealings in Eastern Europe. His record was unremarkable on the surface, but it was enough to set off alarm bells. Granger knew that Reed was a person of interest, but there was something even more disturbing lurking beneath the surface. As he continued to look into Reed's stay, Granger discovered that the man's last interaction with Emily had been captured on surveillance footage. It wasn't much, a brief exchange in the lobby of the hotel late one evening. Emily had been standing near the reception desk, her back to the camera, when Reed walked up to her, leaned in for a few words, and then handed her a small envelope. She looked uncomfortable, almost hesitant to accept it, but she did. Reed then turned and walked away, disappearing into the hallway. Granger played the footage over and over again. The exchange was subtle, almost too subtle, but it was undeniably there. Emily had taken the envelope from Reed, and the look on her face suggested that she hadn't been expecting it. What was in the envelope? Why had Reed approached her, and why had it seemed so important to him? Granger was left with more questions than answers, but one thing was becoming clear. There was a connection between Emily and Reed, and it was one that didn't look like a simple chance encounter. The more Granger dug into Reed's past and his group of friends, the clearer it became that there was something far darker at play. Reed had been traveling with a small circle of people who had, in the weeks leading up to their stay at the resort, been involved in a series of questionable activities. It seemed that they had been gathering information from various locations, moving under the radar and avoiding attention. Granger learned that some of them had connections to criminal networks, operating in the shadows of the international travel scene. While there was no direct evidence linking them to any specific illegal activity, the patterns were unmistakable. Granger's heart began to race as he realized the depth of what he was uncovering. The group wasn't just a collection of tourists. They were involved in something much more sinister, and Emily's involvement in all of this seemed undeniable. But what was her role? Had she become a target? Had she unknowingly walked into something she couldn't escape from? The questions piled up faster than Granger could keep track of, and with every new detail, the case grew darker. There was a nagging feeling in Granger's gut. The hotel was the last place Emily had been. And if Reed and his group had been involved in something illegal, it was more than likely that Emily had stumbled into it by accident. Maybe she had met them by chance, or maybe she had been deliberately drawn into their world, whether she realized it or not. The envelope, the brief encounter, these small details were beginning to paint a picture, one that didn't sit well with Granger. Emily wasn't just a tourist who had gotten lost. She had been caught up in something much more dangerous than anyone had initially suspected. But the biggest question still remained. What had happened to her? Was she being held against her will, or had she simply disappeared into the labyrinth of a criminal network? Had Emily made the wrong choice, the wrong connection at the wrong time? As Granger followed the trail deeper into the shadows, he realized that the mystery surrounding Emily Lawson's disappearance was far from over. It had just taken a darker turn, and he was no closer to finding answers. But one thing was certain. Emily was connected to something that no one could have anticipated, and the truth, as unsettling as it was, seemed more elusive than ever. As David Granger delved deeper into the investigation, the threads connecting Emily to the mysterious group of tourists began to fray. But they didn't lead to answers. They led to more unsettling questions. The group, which had initially seemed like a harmless cluster of travelers, was now at the center of a much darker mystery. The deeper Granger dug into their past, the more disturbing the evidence became. This wasn't just a case of a lone tourist disappearing. It was beginning to feel like something far more sinister. Emily hadn't just stumbled into trouble. It was becoming clear that she may have been lured into it. Granger spoke with hotel staff who had worked during the time the group stayed at the resort. Their recollections of the guests were peculiar. Though they had largely kept to themselves, several of the group members had displayed strange behavior. There had been secretive meetings in the corners of the hotel's lobby, whispered conversations that stopped when anyone walked by. Some guests mentioned late-night outings that were never fully explained, members of the group leaving the hotel after dark and returning hours later, often without saying where they had been. The staff couldn't recall any specific details, but there was a palpable sense of unease among those who had seen these events firsthand. It wasn't just the secrecy. It was the fear, the way people would look over their shoulders when they spoke of these guests, as if they were worried about being overheard. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread through the hotel staff about the mysterious group's true nature. Some claimed they had seen members of the group engaging in strange, secretive activities outside the resort. Whispers of underground networks, illegal operations, and shadowy dealings grew louder. The hotel staff, once again, offered little more than conjecture, but the rumors started to take on a life of their own. Granger was intrigued but wary. It was impossible to distinguish between fact and rumor in a situation like this, and without evidence, there was no way to take these stories seriously. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, the theories of abduction persisted in Granger's mind. The idea that Emily had been caught in a web she didn't understand seemed to hold weight with every new detail that emerged. As Granger pursued these avenues, the case grew more complex and far more dangerous. Emily's involvement with the group, the unexplained meetings, the sense of secrecy that hung around her interactions, it all pointed toward something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. But with the investigation at a standstill, there was little Granger could do. Theories of trafficking, coercion, and abduction swirled in his mind, but without the solid foundation of evidence, there was no way to move forward. Emily's case was slipping further into the shadows, becoming one of many unsolved disappearances that would forever haunt those involved. The mystery was far from over, but without answers, the truth remained out of reach, buried beneath layers of secrecy and hidden danger. As the months dragged on, the investigation into Emily Lawson's disappearance seemed to lose steam. Local authorities, despite their efforts, had hit a wall. The leads had all been exhausted, the theories stretched thin. Emily's family, still reeling from the unknown, could no longer sit quietly by. They had to act. They refused to let her case fade into obscurity, and they knew that if they were going to find her, or at the very least uncover what had happened, they needed to push the authorities once more. They began contacting media outlets, appealing to the public for any information, any shred of evidence that could breathe life back into the case. The media campaign stirred some attention. News outlets ran stories on Emily's disappearance, casting a light on the case that had grown cold. Her face was shown on television screens, her story shared across social media platforms. Her family appeared in interviews, their grief palpable, but their determination stronger than ever. They urged investigators to dig deeper into the mysterious group of foreign tourists who had stayed at the resort around the time Emily vanished. The more they learned about them, the more it seemed like this group was not just a random collection of vacationers. They had been acting suspiciously, their behavior pointing toward something more criminal than anyone had originally thought. Granger, still handling the investigation, couldn't ignore the renewed energy from Emily's family. He was determined not to let this case fade into oblivion, but the lack of concrete evidence continued to hinder progress. Then, as if by coincidence, a small breakthrough appeared. Granger's team uncovered a new lead. Emily had been in contact with a man named Derek Ashford, a former hotel employee. At first glance, Ashford seemed like an ordinary staff member, nothing unusual about him. He had worked at the hotel as a receptionist, but had abruptly resigned just a few months before Emily's disappearance. What initially seemed like a minor detail turned out to be a key piece of the puzzle. Upon digging into Ashford's background, Granger discovered something unsettling. Ashford had left his position at the hotel under murky circumstances that weren't fully explained at the time. He had submitted his resignation with little notice and refused to provide details about his reasons for leaving. According to some of the staff, Ashford had grown increasingly distant and secretive before his sudden departure. No one knew where he went after leaving the hotel, and attempts to contact him had been unsuccessful. Granger's team was left with nothing but a name, a resignation, and a growing suspicion that Ashford's departure might not have been as innocent as it first appeared. What truly raised Granger's concern, however, was Ashford's connection to the foreign group that had been staying at the hotel. Emily had interacted with this group, particularly with Jason Reed, but now it appeared Ashford had been in contact with them as well. It wasn't clear if he had known them before, or if their connection was formed during their stay. But the more Granger investigated, the more it seemed like Ashford had been involved in something far darker than anyone could have guessed. Had he been working with them? Or worse, had he been orchestrating their presence at the resort for some undisclosed purpose? The link between him and the group could explain a lot about Emily's sudden disappearance, but it only raised more questions. Granger's team attempted to track down Ashford, but they quickly hit a dead end. His whereabouts were unknown. They reached out to his last known contacts, but no one seemed to know where he had gone. It was as if he had vanished off the face of the earth, just like Emily. The lack of any tangible evidence linking Ashford to her disappearance made it difficult for the police to pursue him as a suspect. But the fact that Ashford had been connected to the group, and that the group itself seemed involved in something sinister, made him a person of interest in the case. Theories swirled that Ashford had somehow lured Emily into whatever illegal activity the group was involved in. But with no evidence of foul play, the investigation stalled. Months passed, and despite the family's ongoing efforts, the case grew colder. As time went on, the media coverage began to fade, and the case seemed to slip further into the background. Emily's family, though still determined, started to feel the weight of their grief. They had done everything they could to keep the investigation alive, but with each passing day, it seemed less and less likely that they would find any answers. The police had no solid leads, and the once promising clues, Ashford's connection, the mysterious group, were still nothing more than shadows, unsubstantiated theories that led nowhere. The frustration grew. Granger, though not ready to give up, knew the investigation had reached a tipping point. He had no leads left, and his team had exhausted all the options available to them. Theories of trafficking, coercion, and even a personal vendetta were all on the table, but none of them had enough concrete evidence to move the case forward. Emily's disappearance was quickly becoming one of those cases that would haunt the authorities, but never be solved. Her family's fight to keep the case alive had breathed some life back into the investigation, but the momentum quickly faded. As the months turned into a year, the case of Emily Lawson became a forgotten mystery, a story that would never truly find closure. The theories, the leads, and the suspicions all seemed to fade with time. Yet, for those who loved her, the unanswered questions would linger forever. It had been over a year since Emily Lawson disappeared, and the case was nearly forgotten. Despite the initial burst of media coverage and the steady push from her family, the investigation had cooled. There had been no new leads, no breakthroughs, only frustration and dead ends. But just when it seemed as though the case was about to fade into the archives of unsolved mysteries, David Granger received a call that would send the investigation in an entirely new direction. While reviewing old files in an attempt to gather any overlooked detail, Granger came across something that stood out, an anomaly in the guest logs. It was a subtle detail, easily missed among the thousands of names listed during the hotel's busy season, but it caught his eye. One of the members of the mysterious group that had stayed at the resort, someone who had been unaccounted for in the investigation so far, had checked into a different hotel nearby under a false name. Granger's pulse quickened as he ran through the records again. The guest in question was identified as Samuel Hayes, though no one had recalled him by that name at the resort. When Granger compared this name to the records of the group who had been staying at the hotel, he found a matching description for Jason Reed, the man who had interacted with Emily shortly before her disappearance. Hayes was just one of many aliases Reed had used in his travels, but this discovery connected him to an entirely different identity, one that was much more elusive. Granger immediately suspected that the group had been more than just a random collection of tourists. They were part of something far larger, something far more dangerous. He began tracking Hayes's activities, digging deeper into the records of his other stays in the area. His search led to a chilling revelation. Jason Reed, or Samuel Hayes, or whatever name he was using at the time, was connected to a larger syndicate operating in the region. The syndicate was involved in a web of illicit activities, including money laundering, trafficking, and underground operations that stretched across several countries. As Granger dug further into the connections, he uncovered that the group had been more than just transient visitors to the resort. They had been involved in covert operations, using their travels as a cover for their illegal dealings. The evidence suggested that they were experts in the art of blending in, of hiding in plain sight, and using seemingly innocent vacations as fronts for their activities. Emily, with her free-spirited nature and open trust, had likely become entangled in something much darker than she could have imagined. But despite the weight of this new information, Emily's fate remained just as unresolved as it had been months ago. There was now concrete evidence that the group wasn't just a set of disconnected tourists, but rather a criminal organization operating within the shadows. Granger felt the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together. The connection between Jason Reed, the group, and Emily had always felt like it held some hidden truth, and now it seemed clearer than ever. The timing of Emily's arrival at the resort, her interactions with Reed, and the group's clandestine behavior all pointed to the same conclusion. Emily had been drawn into a dangerous situation, perhaps unknowingly, and whatever happened to her that night was tied to this criminal network. Granger's investigation into Reed's whereabouts continued, but each lead led him to more questions. Reed, who had disappeared from the hotel and then vanished entirely, was the key figure. But despite extensive efforts, Granger and his team were no closer to finding him. The lack of a physical body, no ransom demands, and no witnesses left, Granger frustrated and unsure. Emily's room, though untouched, held no answers either. The hotel's security cameras had failed to capture anything substantial, and the staff who had once been so helpful had either moved on or had little new information to provide. What had happened to Emily that night? Had she been trafficked, coerced, or perhaps simply caught in a dangerous game between criminals she didn't understand? Granger considered every possibility, each darker than the last. The group's ties to illicit activity only confirmed what he had suspected all along. This wasn't just a missing persons case. It was a case of a young woman caught in a far-reaching criminal conspiracy. The breakthrough from the past, this new link between Jason Reed and the criminal syndicate, was a pivotal moment. It confirmed that the group had been far more involved than anyone realized, but it also left Granger with an unsettling realization. Knowing the true nature of what had happened didn't bring him any closer to solving Emily's disappearance. He had the pieces, but the puzzle remained incomplete. Granger was now in a race against time, trying to find Reed and the others before they disappeared into the depths of their underground world forever. The investigation was far from over. Granger felt the weight of each unanswered question pressing on him, knowing that with every passing day, the truth about Emily's fate slipped further into the unknown. Despite the revelations, her disappearance remained an unsolved mystery, a tragedy that continued to haunt those who were closest to her. And as Granger followed the trail, he couldn't help but wonder if Emily would ever be found, or if the truth of what had happened that night would forever remain out of reach. A decade had passed since Emily Lawson's disappearance, and the case had long since been filed away, overshadowed by newer investigations and the passage of time. The world had moved on, and for most, Emily had become just another unsolved mystery, a name in a list of cold cases, her story drifting into the ether. Yet for David Granger, the investigation never truly ended. He had kept tabs on the case, revisiting it during quiet moments, hoping for some breakthrough that would bring closure to the questions that had plagued him for years. It was during one of these rare moments that fate intervened. Granger was attending a local law enforcement conference when he ran into an unexpected figure, Danny Brooks, a former hotel employee who had worked at the resort during Emily's stay. The meeting was by chance, but Granger's instinct told him that this was no coincidence. Brooks had been a low-level staff member, not involved in the initial investigation, but he had worked in maintenance during the time of Emily's disappearance. Granger had never heard of him before, but as they spoke, Brooks revealed something that made Granger's pulse quicken. Brooks hesitated at first, clearly unsure whether to speak, but something about the passage of time had made him bolder. He finally confessed that, months after Emily vanished, the hotel staff had received an anonymous tip-off about a hidden room beneath the hotel. At first, no one took the tip seriously. It was dismissed as another random conspiracy theory, one of many that had surfaced after the disappearance. But Brooks, who had worked in maintenance, had heard rumors from his colleagues, whispers of strange noises, of mysterious meetings, and of doors that had been hidden behind layers of old wood and concrete. No one could verify the claims, and those who did try to look into it were quickly discouraged by higher-ups. Brooks, however, had always been curious. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Months later, the rumors had died down, but Brooks kept the memory of the hidden room in the back of his mind. The fact that it was beneath the hotel, a place that had been the epicenter of the investigation into Emily's disappearance, was too significant to ignore. When Granger heard this, the pieces finally began to fall into place. The mysterious group, their clandestine activities, and the fact that they had been staying at the hotel just before Emily vanished all pointed to one thing. The hotel had been more than just a place for tourists. It had been a cover for something much darker. Granger didn't waste a moment. He knew that he had to revisit the hotel, despite the years that had passed. He returned with a small team of investigators, hoping to uncover what had been hidden for so long. With Brooks's help, they began scouring the lower levels of the hotel, checking old blueprints and retracing steps that had been overlooked in previous years. Finally, in the back corner of the maintenance area, behind several layers of drywall, they found it, the hidden door, just as the tip-off had described. The door opened into a series of dimly lit underground rooms, none of which had appeared on the hotel's official floor plans. It was a chilling sight, a stark reminder of how far the resort's owners had gone to keep their secrets. Inside, Granger and his team discovered a small, meticulously kept space. At first glance, it looked like an abandoned storage room, but the walls were lined with shelves that held dozens of old, weathered photographs, photos of Emily Lawson in various locations around the resort. Some were taken from a distance, showing her sitting alone by the pool, walking along the beach, and others appeared to have been taken through windows or hallways, as though someone had been watching her. The photographs sent a chill through Granger. These were not just casual snapshots taken by other tourists. They were intimate, almost voyeuristic in their nature. Whoever had taken them had been following Emily, observing her every move. Some of the photos were dated, indicating that the person had been tracking her from the time she first arrived at the resort until the days before her disappearance. The more Granger looked at the images, the more disturbing it became. There were even photographs of her during her final days at the hotel, showing her entering her room and walking along the hotel's corridors. But despite the haunting evidence, there was no sign of Emily. No clues that indicated where she had gone, no trace of her in the room. It was as if the photos were the only thing left behind, a grim reminder of the years spent in silence. There was no body, no immediate evidence of what had happened to her, and no answers to the one question that still burned in Granger's mind. Where was Emily Lawson? The discovery of the hidden room was a breakthrough, but it was also a dead end. The photographs, chilling as they were, only deepened the mystery. Who had taken them? And why? Had Emily been aware of the surveillance, or had she been unknowingly trapped in a situation she couldn't escape from? The group, whose activities had been so tightly wrapped in secrecy, was clearly involved in something far darker than anyone had initially believed. The raid on the underground rooms confirmed what Granger had feared, that Emily's disappearance was far from an isolated incident. There was an undercurrent of illegal activity, of people living under assumed identities, of networks operating in the shadows. But despite all the evidence, Emily's fate remained unresolved. The case, though reopened with new findings, was far from over. The photographs, while unsettling, were not enough to bring the case to a close. And as the investigation continued, Granger realized that Emily's truth, what had really happened to her, was still buried beneath the weight of too many unanswered questions. 7 years had passed since Emily Lawson vanished without a trace. The case had been buried under layers of time and inaction, her name fading into the cold file of unsolved mysteries. David Granger, who had spent years chasing shadows and uncovering half-truths, had long since moved on to other cases. The investigation into Emily's disappearance had ground to a halt, with no clear answers, no resolution. The hotel where she had disappeared had since fallen into disrepair and was finally slated for demolition and renovation. The workers assigned to clear the space had no idea that the final chapter of Emily's tragic story would unfold within the very walls that had once been her prison. As the demolition crews moved through the basement, clearing out old storage rooms and forgotten corners of the building, they stumbled upon something that shouldn't have been there, an old sealed compartment hidden in the wall. At first, they thought it was just another forgotten storage space, another relic of the hotel's long history. But when the compartment was forced open, the truth began to surface in the most horrifying of ways. Inside, carefully concealed and preserved, were Emily's remains. The discovery sent shockwaves through the small town. Granger, now assigned to oversee the investigation's reopening, was the first to arrive at the scene. As he looked at the remains, the realization hit him like a gut punch. Emily had not just disappeared, she had been kept alive. Hidden away in this secret compartment, isolated from the world for years. The conditions of her remains were disturbing. They were preserved in a way that suggested she had been alive long after the night she vanished. Her body had not been allowed to decay in the normal way. It was as though someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that Emily remained alive, even as her life was slowly stripped away. The more Granger investigated the scene, the clearer it became that Emily had been forced to live in isolation under the strict control of those involved in the illicit group that had been staying at the hotel. It wasn't just an abduction. It was a calculated effort to break her, to psychologically manipulate her into remaining alive in captivity. Her captors had kept her hidden in plain sight, out of the reach of any authorities, concealed in the bowels of the very hotel where she had once been a guest. The secret room, sealed away and forgotten, had become her prison, her tomb. As Granger pieced together the evidence, he uncovered more chilling details. The compartment where Emily had been kept was situated just beneath the hotel's main floor, a hidden place that had remained untouched for years. It was clear that whoever had put her there had planned for her to be forgotten. No one had ever suspected that anything was amiss with the hotel's structure, but now it seemed almost as if it had been built to hide such dark secrets. It became apparent that Emily had been part of a far more insidious scheme than anyone could have imagined. The underground criminal network to which the group belonged had ties to trafficking, psychological manipulation, and illicit dealings. Emily had been coerced into staying alive as a pawn in their game, isolated and controlled, likely subjected to psychological torture, her will slowly being broken over time. She had been a victim, not just of abduction, but of a mind game that had kept her trapped in the shadows for years. The criminals who had orchestrated her disappearance had used her as leverage, manipulating her in ways that no one could have understood until it was far too late. As Granger's team examined the details of Emily's captivity, it was clear that she had been held in that compartment for a long time. The preservation of her remains suggested she had been cared for, fed, hydrated, and kept alive under strict conditions. It was a twisted form of care, though, one that robbed her of her freedom and her dignity. Granger's stomach turned as he realized that Emily had lived in this hidden space, her world confined to the small, cold walls of that compartment, possibly even watching the hotel continue on, unaware that she was still there, hidden away from the world. But the most chilling discovery of all came when Granger revisited Emily's hotel room, the very room where she had disappeared. It had never been disturbed, despite the years of renovations and changes that had taken place within the hotel. Room 315 remained untouched. Even the furniture had been left as it had been the night she vanished, the cup of coffee still sitting on the table, its remnants long cold, as though time itself had refused to touch the room. It was as though the room had been preserved, left in that state as a cruel reminder of Emily's final days in captivity. The temperature of the room, though unoccupied for years, was warmer than expected, an eerie, unnatural warmth that seemed to linger as if her presence still haunted it. The realization hit Granger hard. The hotel, in all its secrecy, had been more than a place of business. It had been a prison, a mausoleum for a woman whose life had been torn apart by a network of criminals. The room where Emily had once walked had become a memorial, not just to her tragic fate, but to the cruelty and manipulation that had kept her alive for years after her disappearance. The investigation had finally uncovered the truth, but it came at a cost. Emily's fate, though now clear, left a gaping hole of unanswered questions. Who had masterminded her captivity? How had they kept her hidden for so long? And what had driven her captors to such lengths to ensure her silence? Emily's remains were finally returned to her family, but the pain of knowing the truth could not ease the torment of knowing how her life had ended. The case, though solved in the most horrifying way, would never truly bring closure. Emily's final days, her suffering, her isolation, remained a cruel reminder of a dark chapter in the hotel's history. For Granger, the truth had come too late, and the haunting image of that warm, untouched hotel room would stay with him for the rest of his career.